Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast, Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. For today, I'm especially grateful to Caleb Jackson, who accepted to come and talk with us about the very important and beautiful subject of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that happened to be on the same day where our Eastern Orthodox friends are celebrating the resurrection or the Easter Sunday. So, happy Easter. And Caleb, welcome back. Thank you so much for finding time for ourselves and for us and the audience. Can you please introduce us yourself again and say something about, your work, your ministry, your spiritual and theological education, but also the book you wrote when it comes to the topic that we'll be covering tonight.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Nicholas. So I'm Caleb Jackson, as you said. I would call myself a theological hobbyist. So I just really enjoy studying topics about theology, philosophy, and early Christianity. In particular, I've spent a lot of time looking past couple years now on the subject of Christian miracles and modern charism activism and stuff like that, which kind of came out of my work on the resurrection back in 2019 when I had first tried writing on it in that way. So yeah, the subject of just what did Jesus rise from the dead? Is there a supernatural realm? All just was always really interesting to me. So I'm currently working on a fairly large, probably 2-volume work on miracles that I will hopefully have out sometime at the end of this year. But I did have a book called Undead back a couple years ago now that I wrote on the resurrection called Undead, a historical investigation, the most famous miracle in history. And that was the first one I wrote. So there are some things there, just writing style wise, editing wise, that I wish I could change. Everyone doesn't like their first stuff, but I think overall, I still would generally agree with most of the stuff I argued in that book, with maybe a few caveats. So that's sort of what sparked my interest in the resurrection in that way. And I was really grateful to help my friend Than Christophilus, who has his own channel and ministry called Exploring Reality, which you should definitely check out if you haven't already. He recently did a debate with Matt Dillahunty, who's a pretty well-known skeptic online, on the resurrection. And so I was very grateful that myself and many other people within our kind of inner circle of friends, who are all very intelligent, very talented in this area, were able to help draft that and tweak it and really prep what we thought was the best opening for a resurrection argument that one could do in a limited time frame of a debate setting. So I'm very happy to have done all of that. But great to be here. And I know we had set this up, and providentially it's glad that it worked out. And I know we're kind of winging this a little bit because it was planned last minute, but I think this will be a good show. So
yeah, I just want to say that I know about Than's work only because you recommended him, and that episode with Matt Dillahunty, because Matt Dillahunty doesn't agree, or just not every debate that he does with Christians goes well, but that one went well. And I was glad to see how actually they became friends, even though Matt is a former Christian and Tan is, praise God, a man of God and an apologist. So I was glad that how that went. I didn't know you participated in that. I'm even more glad now.
I didn't participate in the debate. I helped write. I helped write it and help kind of prep Than along with many other people. So.
Yeah, that's great. And I also want to say, several months ago, Caleb and I did one episode on the near-death experiences, healing and miracles. So, always go back and check that episode, but also, support Caleb's work. I included the Amazon link for his book in the description. Support his work and just, help the brother out.
Yeah.
Caleb, when it comes to this topic of resurrection, can we please start by saying, if you can please tell to the audience, why is it important not just to have faith in the resurrection of Christ, but also to be willing to gather the evidence like you did and to rationally present the case of resurrection before the skeptics?
Yeah, so I mean, the resurrection is typically seen as the fundamental miracle of Christianity. It's what vindicates Christ's claims of divinity, or at least of messiahship. Jesus of Nazareth historically was believed to have been the Messiah and to be the Son of God. And according to Paul, the resurrection is what certifies that, right? In Romans 1, where he says how Jesus was made the Son of God by the resurrection, vindicated it. So you have Jesus of Nazareth, who's making all these claims about himself that gets the Roman populace, and especially the Jewish Sanhedrin, riled up against him. And so they in corresponding with the Romans execute him. And the resurrection is sort of meant to be the God of Israel, to be Yahweh's reversal of the death penalty. It's like you may have sentenced Jesus to death, but I'm reversing the order in that way. So it's basically God saying, no, this is my guy. What he's preaching is from my authority in that way. So the resurrection is not just some random guy being given life again. In that way, it has a lot of significance in terms of vindicating the teachings of Christianity and the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth himself. So that's why it's really important. And when you compare it to other foundation miracles in other religions, like Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad has the angel Gabriel, appear to him and give him the Quran, by touching him, and he recites it. Or Joseph Smith, where an angel comes down and gives him or shows him where the Book of Mormon, the tablets are, the golden plates. So, most major religions, besides perhaps Hinduism and some of the other ones, have some kind of origin story of a miracle that vindicates it, allegedly. So I think the resurrection is by far the most scrutinized and looked at of these founding ones, of the major world religions. So that's why it's important to look at this evidentially and historically.
Yeah, and not surprisingly, I noticed all these years that Christianity is the most attacked religion from all the religions out there. And usually, when our friends atheists, when they attack or mock any other religion, usually Christianity and Christ are number one. So I think that brings more importance of us, especially you, doing this episode tonight, of giving not just this faith-based case for Christ, but also intellectually. It's based on data, because you have written so many of this information in your book. So I'm just looking forward to start with that. When it comes to our topic for tonight, you want to maybe start with resurrection methodology?
Yeah, so when we talk about resurrection methodology in the world of Christian apologetics and discussion, there's typically a few different ways in which people go about it. So the most common by far, I think the most popularized one, is what some people would call the minimal facts argument. And this was was started by Gary Habermas, who just finished writing one volume of, I think, 4, large book, 5,000 pages on the subject of the minimal facts. And the minimal facts says that we're only going to take the arguments and the data points that virtually every scholar, whether they're Christian, atheist, Jewish, what have you, will accept based on historical evidence in the New Testament. And from that, they try to scaffold a case for the resurrection. So they're saying, for the sake of argument, let's assume the Bible is not inerrant. Let's assume that some of the stuff in it's not historical. That's fine. We're just going to work with these basically bedrock data points about that. And so the minimal facts would be facts that are accepted by 95% of scholars or more. You're always going to have a few outliers, but the vast majority ones that hold to the mainstream views that aren't fringe. So the minimal facts would basically be that Jesus died by crucifixion. That's something that virtually everyone who's not a mythicist would hold to. That after his death, many of his followers sincerely believed that they experienced him after as resurrected from the dead. That they were willing to undergo punishments and persecution, or at least potential persecution, for this belief. It's not saying that they all necessarily died, but that they were at least willing to die, willing to go through hardships. And the last one was that the persecutor Saul of Tarsus ended up converting to Christianity, becoming St. Paul after he had an experience with what he believed to be the resurrected Christ. So those are the minimal facts that most scholars would agree on, and most of those come directly from the epistles. They will say that Paul is the best witness because he's the only eyewitness. A lot of scholars don't think that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, that they're passed down traditions, so Paul is typically where they want to start at. So it's the minimal facts approach. Then you'll have what I would use the term the moderate facts approach, and this is something more similar to what like William Lane Craig would use, which is taking the same idea of the minimal facts, but just expanding it. So instead of 95% of scholars, we're including maybe 70% or more. So typically held views, but not consensus views. So that would include adding things like the discovery of the empty tomb by women and stuff like that, which bolsters the case. But you're including a few more points there that are more controversial among critical scholars that are going to have some more pushback in terms of the acceptance of that you have to be willing to defend. And then you have the maximal data approach, which is something that Tim and Lydia McGrew are famous for arguing for, among others like William Paley from the 18th century. which is to say that we're going to, instead of starting with these small facts everyone agrees on and working up, we're going to argue for the broad reliability of the New Testament and the Gospels. So they maximal data proponents like the McGrews, and on the popular level like Eric Manning or David Palman and others that you've mentioned before, they'll basically say, let's start with showing why the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are reliable. They will talk about external confirmation. They'll talk about authorship. They'll talk about corroborating details. They'll talk about undesigned coincidences and the way that these texts sort of unintentionally confirm each other's validity. It's a lot to get to that we won't have time to discuss all here, but basically showing that these Gospels were written by firsthand eyewitnesses who were close up to the facts and were trying to report them accurately. And then they'll say, okay, well, given that, if we can establish that, then you have the trilemma of, were these people lying? Were they sincerely mistaken, or were they telling the truth? Because we've already established that these are from firsthand eyewitnesses. So this is not a later legend that's passed down that so-and-so heard from so-and-so. So that's the maximal data approach. So the maximal data approach would be the strongest in theory, but it involves you defending a lot of premises, a lot of points that many skeptics would have contention with. And so that it gets a lot more outside the realm of mainstream scholarship, shall we say. So that's generally the way that it goes. Now, for the approach that Than Christophilus did in his debate, we were going off of the fourth model, which isn't very often discussed, but it's something that we were kind of building off of Richard Swinburne. And that's, I think we would sometimes call that the a priori approach or the natural theology approach. But it's the idea that you can actually start without even using the Bible with certain theological arguments. I was going to say presumptions, but you give arguments for them, for saying that God exists, that if God exists and he's all loving, that God would have a reason to come down and become incarnate, to become a moral teacher and atone for sins, and that he would vindicate this with some kind of super miracle, right? And so you argue for that first and say, well, now given that data, the fact that we have a resurrection claim here by Jesus of Nazareth who claimed to be from God raises the probability. It makes it a lot more plausible that this is from God and that Jesus was who he said he was, because we've established this reference class. So it works a lot with probability. Again, that all of these, we could do a whole show on just each one of them because it would be so much data to go over. But those are the general approaches that people take. So I tend to like the last one the most. I think it's combining a lot of stuff outside of the realm of history. So it's combining natural theology and philosophy and history along with it. But I think it's the most ambitious and most interesting of the four approaches. But you see a mix of all of them in the apologetic sphere and in history. So
thank you so much for all that information. I'm learning as much as while you're talking. I'm learning so much from you, and I believe that the audience does the same. So I appreciate that. Thank you for that. When it comes to the Jesus's death, we know that some skeptics, including Muslims, they doubt that Jesus even died on the cross. They will come up with different theories, and one of them was like, well, even though Jesus was flogged, and even though he was beaten, and even though he was put on the cross, and despite the Roman soldier, piercing his side with a spear, Jesus still somehow survived. Can we medically assess this? Would this be even possible for someone to survive all of this?
Yeah, so we should always caveat by saying that in history, it's all about probabilities, that we can't, unless we're up there observing it, we can never know for sure, right? But given all the details, if they are accurate in the way they're being described, it seems like by all accounts, Jesus would have succumbed to his injuries and died either on the cross or soon after, given the beating and crucifixion and all of those wounds. There's a acquaintance of mine named Joseph Bergeron, who's a medical doctor who wrote a book on it a few years back. I forget what it's called. I think it's a medical perspective of the death of Christ or something like that. But I recommend looking into that. It says for a good assessment. I know there was an older study back in the 1980s by, I want to say it was the American Medical Association or the American Heart Journal or something like that, by Dr. Zugabe and others, who basically did a whole article about here's how Jesus would have died from pulmonary, from asphyxiation, because when you're on the cross, it basically suffocates you. I know Bergeron, I think, pushes back against that and argues it was from blunt force trauma, but regardless, the chances of him surviving would have been, next to none. Now, if you're a Muslim and want to say what Allah could have miraculously saved his life or switched it out. Obviously, we can't disprove that through medical science, because you could always just say there's a miracle done. But I think from a natural perspective, there's no real reason to think that Jesus was alive at the time. And even if he was, to be wrapped up in bandages and put in, a dark tomb without food or water or treatment, he probably would have succumbed to his injuries pretty quickly if he wasn't already dead at that point. As far as surviving crucifixion, the only count that I'm aware of that we have in history was the Jewish author, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that he once saw 3 people being crucified, and he's sort of in cahoots with the Romans. He's good friends with some of them, so he asks them to be taken down, and so they do take them down. And I believe even with medical treatment, most of them don't survive. I think only one of them survived, but even with medical treatment, the other 2 didn't, and they weren't on there for as long or go through all of the stuff that Jesus went through. So it seems fairly implausible to think that that would have happened. And of course, David Strauss, the German critic, said that even if we granted that Christ, did all of that and was able to survive somehow, it wouldn't have invoked a feeling of victory when they saw the bloody, wounded Jesus slowly crawling, starving outside of the grave. It would have been like, oh my gosh, get this man some help, not, oh my gosh, he's still alive in a glorious body that Paul talks about, right? Philippians 3. So I don't think virtually no one argues for the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus didn't die, other than Muslims, but virtually no naturalistic scholar today, New Testament scholar that I'm aware of, argues that. Most of it comes from the 18th centuries. It's been pretty outdated.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also want to read a sentence or two by a secular doctor, Metherell, who said that the spear apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. So when the spear was pulled out, some fluid came out. And then he says how Jesus couldn't possibly have faked his death because you can't fake the inability to breathe for long. And I was, wow. I was like, I mean, even the medicine confirms this couldn't be something that you can just, leave the cross and just walk out like nothing happened and, hope to heal eventually. I'm glad that you mentioned one of the extra biblical sources that mention, Jesus' suffering and death. But also I heard that, there was historian Lucian and also Talmud who have no reason to be biased to mention that Jesus died on the cross, because they were not pro-Christ. Yet they do mention, and even though these, quotations and their writings are not part of the New Testament Bible, yet we see this as an extra biblical source of approval what we read in the New Testament to be true. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So you have Tacitus and Lucian of Samosata and a few others who imply or state that Jesus was crucified. Now you have to be a little bit careful because they're not writing as contemporaries. They're writing significantly, a few decades later. So who their sources are is up for question, whether they're just hearing this from other Christians or not. But regardless, you are correct that we do have reference to the crucifixion of Jesus in these other sources. And of course, by Paul himself. And Paul claims to have, known the apostles well. He met James and Peter, according to his own writings in Galatians. So Paul would have probably been in a place to know if Jesus had been crucified or not, especially since he was a Pharisee during Passover. It seems hard to imagine that he wouldn't have been there, or at least have heard about it from other people. So I don't think anyone really questions that Jesus was crucified, other than people like Muslims who have a theological disposition to work against that.
Thank you. We know from the scriptures after Jesus' death that he was placed in a tomb. Yet when the disciples went later to visit the tomb, they found it empty. One of the first things we can mention when it comes to this point of the topic for tonight is what, for me, one of the insane claims, but still not impossible, was that, like, well, maybe the body was dug up with someone and then the wild dogs ate Jesus's body. But is there something that you can comment on that when it comes to this claim?
So I will say that the burial and empty tomb of Jesus specifically is an area of the resurrection that I've spent a lot of time on and I'm really interested in, because it is a fairly contentious, or at least not a consensus on it, and in that way. But I've written a few blog articles, and I can send the links later on if you want, on the website thinkchristiantheism.com. I've contributed a few on the burial and the empty tomb. So to get into the whole defense of that would be longer than we have here, unfortunately. And I also did a debate on it with Stephen Ford. It's on YouTube if you want to check that out, on the empty tomb specifically. But so the reference that you have to the dogs is something that a lot of people will say. I think it was first, well, maybe not first, but most popularly said by John Dominic Crossan, New Testament scholar, back in, I want to say, the 90s. And so what that's getting at is the idea that typically when people were crucified in Rome, it was common to not bury them because it was part of the punishment. It was shameful. You were up on a cross naked, and they would just leave them there to rot, or they would take the body and throw it in a pile. And sometimes wild animals would come to eat it, and you'd have dogs and birds and stuff like that. Sorry to fix my screen there. Dogs and birds to come and feast on the carcasses, in a really gruesome depiction. So there have been some people like Crossan, and more recently Bart Ehrman, who switched his position on it, who said, well, Jesus probably wasn't buried at all because it would have been out of the practice. But that does sort of misunderstand Jewish law and Roman law, which don't mandate that. And there's a lot of articles by people like Byron McCain and Jody Magnus and Craig Evans and John Cook, among others, peer-reviewed articles published that all seem to sort of agree that, yeah, that probably wouldn't have happened to Jesus. Because all the references we have, with perhaps maybe one exception, and I think it's in the Mishnah and the Sinachat, say that all of these references to people not being buried after crucifixion are outside of Jerusalem, but Jewish law specifically mandated that bodies had to be buried. It's in Deuteronomy, I think 23, 21, or 21. So Jews would have had very much sensitivities. In fact, burying a body after it's been executed was one of the top priorities you could possibly do. You see that, and I think it's the book of Tobit, where one of the characters is burying bodies of the executed just out of courtesy, because to leave a body unburied would be a defilement to Yahweh and to the land, and was absolutely a big no-no in that way. So you couldn't have done that. Now, the argument's like, okay, obviously Jews would have wanted Jesus to be buried, but would the Romans have allowed that? They didn't care about Jewish law. And that's another misnomer, because we do know that typically Romans, in most cases, did allow Jews to go about to practice their day-to-day customs. They weren't allowed to execute, but Josephus specifically says that before the war, it was common to bury crucified victims before sunset, as Jewish law described. And so, although you may have had exceptions to that in cases of treason, which Jesus was not charged with treason, he was charged with sedition, which is a lower crime. The Roman law says in the Digesta that the family can come, they can request the body from the governor. The governor has the jurisdiction to say yes or no. And you see this in places like Egypt and Alexandria, where Philo mentions this. And if he says yes, then the family can take the body, or whoever's requesting can take it and bury it if they want. And typically this wasn't denied, except for if the person committed treason in that way. So that was the normal practice. Now, with Jesus, it gets complicated because he had been executed officially by the Roman officials, but he had been condemned by the Jewish court. The Jewish court wasn't allowed to execute people under Roman rule, so they were kind of trying to find a loophole here in terms of that. So the Mishnah, which is sort of a collection of Jewish oral law written about 200 AD, but predates the time of Jesus and is contemporary with that, describes that when the Sanhedrin would execute people or condemn someone to be executed, they would have burial spots to bury them in. So you'd have a spot for the hanged, a spot for the decapitated, a spot for the burned. So some people will say that Jesus was buried shamefully in the place where the strangled would have been buried, because that's how you die, is by asphyxiation on the cross. And that's what would have happened to the body. Now, I think that is a plausible view, but I don't really buy that, because for one, I think it wouldn't really explain the empty tomb for a reason I'll get to in a minute. I don't think the story would still be able to come about. But even if we were to grant that, the story that we have of Joseph of Arimathea, who is a member of the Sanhedrin burying Jesus, is really weird and sort of goes against the overall narrative of Mark. And I wrote a blog article on this if you want more details. But Mark tries to depict Jesus as fulfilling these prophecies in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 about the servant of God being mistreated and treated badly and shamefully. And in these chapters, we have the metaphorical death of this servant, and we have references to his body being mistreated, right? It's like there's places in Psalm 22 where it's like, oh, my enemy gazes over my bones, or the dogs come and surround me, or, he was buried with the wicked. So there's plenty of verses where if Jesus had been dishonorably buried, they could have gone and said, oh, look, this is just further reverence of that. And it's weird to think that they would have been embarrassed by that, because they weren't embarrassed about Jesus being crucified. If anything, they were sort of hamming that in to say, oh, every blow, like, let's emphasize that he was beaten and so mistreated for our sins, because it makes the passion that much more powerful. So I think if Jesus had been dishonorably buried, Christians would have used that only to further the passion of Christ and to further the suffering he went to and the shame he went through and the embarrassment, just to make the resurrection all that more special. So the fact that we don't see that we see for the first time in the passion narrative, Jesus is actually being treated with respect by some of the very people who had condemned him, is very, very weird. And so, but it doesn't work either way, because on the one hand, Joseph does bury Jesus in his own family tomb, according to Matthew, covers him with spices, very elegant, very much a rich way to a rich person's entombment. So clearly it's being honorable, but at the same time, there's dishonorable elements in there. Jesus is not, if you notice, Joseph is never helped by the family or friends of Jesus. Typically, it was a collection where you would help, wash the body, and the family would be very much involved in burying it. But the women are only said to watch Joseph doing this. They don't offer to help. They don't really do anything other than just watch from a distance. And that would have been very strange. And there's also no reference to mourning, because typically when someone died in Judaism, there would be, 7 days of mourning. There'd be fasting. It was a very public thing. You see this when Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus. There's people there all mourning very loudly, very publicly. It was something that the whole village would have been familiar with. But you don't see that with Jesus' case, because the Mishnah says that if someone's been condemned as a criminal, they do not get public mourning. You can mourn privately in your own home, but you cannot have public displays of mourning in that kind of way. So with the burial story of Joseph, it's kind of a 50-50, because it's like there's some things that are obviously honorable, but there are some things that seem to be dishonorable. So if it's meant to be an apologetic story to make the burial of Jesus just look really good because they were embarrassed by it, I don't know why they didn't remove the dishonorable elements. And if it was meant to be a purely a dishonorable burial, then I don't know why they would include the honorable elements. So it seems to me like the authors didn't really know what to think of it, and they were just writing it as they were aware of it. And my guess is that Joseph was probably trying to give some respect to Jesus and honor to him, because maybe he did think he was a legitimate rabbi and respected some of his teachings, sort of like how Nicodemus did. But he had to follow Jewish law. So he was trying to find a loophole, which is like, well, technically I can bury him in this way, and it's not violating Jewish law because they're not mourning, he's not with his family, but I'm going to make it as nice as I can. I'm putting lipstick on a corpse, basically. So I think because of all those weird elements, it's really hard for me to imagine a narrative in which it makes sense to invent the story. So it does seem to me to be an indication of a general historical core, that there probably was a Joseph of Arimathea who buried Jesus in a tomb of some kind in that way. So I know it was a long answer to your question, but that's generally how I view the burial.
No, thank you for every detail. I enjoy, because it helps us to see from different perspectives and gives us so many little details that I think many Christians are not aware. So thank you for that. What about the claim that, hey, what if the grave robbers, stole the body? Is there anything that we can respond to this?
Yeah, so that's a different claim in terms of the body was stolen. That's been something that some people like Richard Carrier or even Dale Allison have sort of suggested. And it's, when we're looking at it, if one grants that the tomb was empty, which is a whole other argument, there's different things you can say. You can say maybe the body was moved by Joseph because it was a temporary burying place, or for other reasons. And I think those have their own problems, because it's like, well, couldn't that just have been corrected very easily if there was a misunderstanding? And not to mention that in Jewish law, when a person was buried, even if they were a criminal in the Mishnah, the family would have to come and eventually rebury the bones of the person, a year or so after the flesh had decomposed, in the family tomb. They would move it from the bad tomb to the family tomb. And so wherever the body of Jesus was going to be would have to be identifiable, and it would have to be in such a way where his family would have been able to transport the bones following that entombment. So I think other reasons don't work for those hypotheses, but the body stolen one is a little bit harder. Most people don't think the disciples stole the body, but you'll have people who say that maybe it was tomb robbers or magicians, because there are some spells that require human body parts to take. And so maybe it was some necromancers who took the body, and that's why the stone was rolled away, because and that's why it was done in the middle of the night, because it was illegal. So you could say that, but there, how many of these sorcerers or necromancers actually lived in Jerusalem is unknown. It probably wasn't very many, because it was a crime to do that in Israel. You couldn't practice witchcraft or anything like that. It was very much frowned upon. Now you could say, well, people break the law all the time, so maybe people were doing it. But it's also kind of strange to think of people taking a whole body, because in most of these cases, the spells only require, a hand, sometimes a head. So why you would have to haul an entire body with you and not just hack off a part and take it and run seems very inconvenient of doing it. So yeah, to find a real motive and a plausible way to think of why people would do this is very difficult. You could always surmise, maybe Luke says that there were 70 disciples of Jesus after the 12. Maybe it was one of them. And at that point, we can always speculate, and we can't know for sure. But I don't think there's any really realistic way of thinking about it in terms of a body being moved that doesn't sort of have its own issues. But people who wouldn't say, well, a resurrection isn't a plausible solution either. That's sort of its own conundrum in itself. But I don't think that general hypotheses about the body being moved or stolen are very, very persuasive for that reason.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the disciples potentially moving the body, like one of the skeptical claims. But when we read how the apostles behaved all the way, from Jesus's ministry until his death, we don't see them as brave people, especially not going against the Roman soldiers. And that's another claim. Well, maybe the Roman soldiers fell asleep. They're professionals. If that would have happened, I read that they would be put to death. That was a huge no-no for Roman soldiers to fall asleep while they would be guarding a tomb. So maybe we can say something when it comes to this claim that, hey, maybe Roman soldiers were not doing, very well their job. Maybe they fell away or fell asleep or did something else while someone else came and took the body.
Yeah, and with the Roman soldiers, that's a lot of skeptical scholars don't think, or just a lot of scholars in general don't think that that's historical. At least they have questions about it, because it's only referenced in Matthew, and it seems sort of implausible to think that they would have. It seems like something that Christians would have said to kind of combat the idea that the body was stolen. It's like, oh no, there were guards there, and to combat that. But what's interesting is that you sort of see this back and forth where the Christians claim the body's gone, and the response is, well, maybe it was stolen, and then there were guards there. And then it's like, well, maybe the counter to that is, well, maybe the guards fell asleep, and that's when it was stolen. The counter is that, no, maybe the guards didn't fall asleep. They were just bribed to say that they fell asleep by the Sanhedrin. You see this back and forth, right? So yeah, you have this back and forth, but I think the point of that is that when the body went missing, if you think this was an early tradition, then the response wasn't, no, he's right there, you're wrong. It was, well, the body must have been taken by someone, and that was the response in that way. Now, a lot of that depends on how early you think it was. If you think the empty tomb is a much later tradition in Mark, and by the time Mark was written, no one would have known the whereabouts of it, then you could say that. But if you do think that this was a very early tradition that was probably being preached early on, and 1 Corinthians 15:4 and the pre-Markan Passion story and other places like that, then it's plausible to think that there was probably some kind of polemic that the Sanhedrin would have used in response to that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to read quickly what William Lane Craig, whom you mentioned maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, what he said. Especially because you mentioned Jewish custom when it comes to the burial. This is another custom that William Lane Craig, a famous Christian apologist, says. There was another custom. The graves of the holy men were well preserved or even reverenced as a shrine by the Hebrews. The fact that Jesus' tomb was not venerated as a shrine indicated that the tomb was empty. Had the body of Jesus laid in the grave, it would have attracted many people. The fact that there were no gatherings around the grave and no reverence for the body shows that the location of the tomb did not have any religious significance for the religious Jews. Jesus' body was not there, as it was a well-known fact among his contemporaries.
It's funny that you say that, because I disagree with that slightly, because it kind of goes both ways. Because people like Gerd Ludemann will make the opposite argument and say, Jewish tombs were often venerated, and the fact that Jesus wasn't venerated means that they didn't know where the tomb was, that the empty tomb is a later tradition. No one knew at the time where the body was put. That's why we don't have any veneration, right? But I actually do think that there was quite a lot of veneration. I couldn't pinpoint when the time frame of that was, but I do think that the current tomb that we have in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we can't prove it to absolute certainty, but I would say there's a higher than 50% chance that that's probably the place that early Christians are venerating. And I have an article on that, the blog article, if you want to check that out as well. Be hard to get into that right now, but part of it is because all of the archaeological evidence around that site is consistent with how the Gospels describe it, and the location that the spot is in. Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, and that's how because they didn't want the bodies inside the walls of Jerusalem. And so when they first found the spot, it was inside the walls. And so, well, this can't be right? But when they kept digging back, I think it was in the 1960s, they found there was actually a second set of walls that were the earlier ones, because Herod, I want to say it was Antipas, had expanded it about 40 AD. So roughly, 7 to 10 years or so after Jesus died, those were expanded and moved backwards. So at the time Jesus was killed, those walls actually were there, and he would have been outside of it. So the point is, if the walls were expanded around the 40s AD, if you're a Christian who finds this spot decades later, especially after the fall of Jerusalem, you got quite lucky that you found the spot that happened to be consistent with what it would have had to be in the 30s AD, right? Especially since Jerusalem's a very old city with plenty of tombs from all different kinds of eras. So to get not only the right location correct, but also the right kind of tomb, the dating of the tomb. They didn't find a tomb from the Old Testament periods, right? Like the Garden Tomb, which is much older. It's pretty remarkable. So we can't prove it to 100% certainty that is the site of Jesus, but I think that there were Christians who probably were venerating it because it was a special spot, because the body wasn't there. And that's what I think it's Eusebius tells us about the Emperor Hadrian. He says that in the 130s or so AD, Christians were venerating that spot. And so he built a temple on top of it to stop them, to I think it was to Jupiter, to one of the Roman gods, to stop it. And when Constantine converted to Christianity, the 4th century, he went to Jerusalem, and they said, oh, if you knock, Jesus' tomb is underneath that temple that Hadrian built. And so they knocked that temple down, and they did find that there was a tomb there. And, from all the archaeology that we have, there's a tomb there, and it's surrounded by other tombs in that layer that are also around from the 1st century, tombs of very wealthy people. So it looks like there was a 1st century cemetery for the rich that this spot was on outside the walls of Jerusalem, which is consistent with Jesus being buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Again, it's not absolute proof, but I think it's pretty good evidence that there was veneration, that we actually probably have the site.
Thank you. And the last point that skeptics can bring when it comes to the Jesus's tomb was, empty. Well, maybe the female disciples went to the wrong tomb, but we know that this is not true, because you just mentioned that they were following Joseph, and we see this especially in Luke 23, verses 50 to 56, that the female disciples exactly knew where the location of Jesus's tomb was. So I think this is very easy to refute. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, and as I said before, even if they had made a mistake, it seems like it'd be something pretty easy to correct, especially if they have to go and eventually rebury the bones of Jesus, right? That at some point Joseph could have said, oh God, like when they were starting to proclaim this, that the body's right there, and that you simply got the tomb wrong. But it is interesting that the New Testament does have the women be the ones to do it, because the women are the only ones who see this location, besides Joseph, and Joseph never comes out again to confirm it. So when the disciples are told, hey, here's Jesus' tomb, they are taking the women's word for it. And in that culture, it would have at least been a risk. There's debate as to how much a woman's testimony was or wasn't trusted, but it still would have been much riskier to have them be the ones guiding this process than to have the male disciples do it, or to have another one do it, right? Like in the Gospel of Peter, you have it to where there's a whole crowd watching the resurrection happen, a crowd of Jews and the Roman soldiers, and they see Jesus arise from the tomb. But in none of the Gospels do we actually see the resurrection itself. We see the tombs empty, and then we see the appearances afterwards, but no one actually sees Jesus himself get out of the tomb. So if I was going to make a story like that, if people were saying the body was stolen, I would expect people to say, oh, no, the body wasn't stolen because people saw him actually come out of the tomb. And we don't ever see that except for in the later non-canonical gospels. So yeah, I am inclined to think there was a burial spot that had a missing body that people found and were anxious about. And that's why we have, stories about missing body of Jesus.
Thank you. When it comes to the subtopic of Jesus's post-mortem appearances, what is there so significant for us that we can say when Jesus first appeared to the 11, and as we know, Thomas was not there with them, but then Jesus also appeared to Thomas. So what is significant about this account?
Yeah, so it's significant because of the number of people, and that you have a pretty solid tradition across Paul and the others talking about how many people saw Jesus after he rose from the dead, or at least had resurrection appearances. Now, where it gets difficult is that people will often say, critical scholars will say that Paul mentions these in 1 Corinthians 15, which is our earliest source, because he's citing a creed that's probably maybe 2 to 3 years old that he likely got from Peter and James, although we don't know that for sure. And that this creed mentions Jesus appearing to Peter, to the 12, to over 500, to the apostles, and et cetera, until he gets to Paul. So that's where most scholars are going with that. So when you have the accounts in the Gospels about Thomas touching Jesus and Jesus eating a meal with him, a lot of critical scholars think that that's later invention, that that's something that was made later on because people were basically accusing Jesus of having spiritually rose, what's called docetism, that he wasn't actually a physical person. And so that's why you have these later details added in there. So it does get a little bit complicated with that, but that's where people will sometimes propose hallucinations, at least on Paul's part. They'll say, well, look, Paul says he saw a light and it was a revelation, and he doesn't tell us what the disciples saw. So for all we know, that's probably what they saw. And these stories in the Gospels are later embellishments of that. That's typically how people view when it comes to hallucinations or to visions in that particular way, with the post-mortem appearances. But it does get complicated because we do have visions of Jesus even today. I have a book back there by Philip Weeb discussing, modern day visions of Jesus from the 70s to the 90s, I think is when it was published. And I know people personally who claim to have had a Christophany, as it's called, where they'll have a waking, it's not even when they're like asleep, like a waking vision of Jesus. And I think people often have hallucinations. I don't think that every one of those is legitimate, but there's some really, really interesting cases where people will either get information or will recover from some kind of illness that they had after Jesus appeared to them and tells them you'll be healed on this particular date. And so because we have stuff like that happening even in contemporary accounts, I am much more hesitant to just write off stories about people seeing Jesus. So when the disciples say that they saw Jesus and touched with him and ate with him, or at least when we have accounts of the disciples doing that, yes, some people might think that's later legendary development, but because we have contemporary accounts that have just as much physicality, where people will see dead loved ones and they'll hug them and they'll feel like the heat on their body, or they'll see Jesus appear and Jesus will literally leave like marks in the floor where he was, and there's veridical elements to them. It gets really compelling after a while. And it's like, well, whatever we think these are, it's something that should be looked into more. And I'm not entirely sure that they can be explained purely by intramental psychological processes.
Yeah, when I'm reading John 20 and Luke 24, and when I see Jesus's appearances after his resurrection, and where disciples are thinking he's a ghost, I find that those accounts are very compelling, especially when he appears himself to Thomas, and Thomas, who was doubting prior to that, now Thomas falls down. He says, "My Lord and my God." I see that so compelling. And once I remember, I mentioned that to a Muslim friend at work who was, of course, trying to dispute that. So I remember his answer was like, well, yeah, he saw Jesus and he fell down, but he said, "My Lord and my God," to God, like, oh my God, like I see Jesus, but not actually attributing Jesus' divinity, which is another topic, I know, but it just reminds
yeah. But then if you have Matthew 28, where the women bow at his feet and worship him, like it's kind of,
yeah.
If Jesus is a prophet who's not claiming to be God, he's not doing a very good job of rebuking people who are worshiping him falsely. Like that would be idolatry. So yeah, it's
Exactly.
not just
I
Thomas
think
saying
that
it.
this passage both shows Jesus' divinity and his resurrection status. So this also, defeats the idea that maybe Jesus, like you said, just resurrected spiritually. No, he resurrected bodily, because he said, "Do you think I'm a ghost? Well, ghosts don't have bones and flesh. Touch me, feel me." So again, like I said, I just feel that compelling. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What about when Jesus showed himself on the road to Emmaus and to the 500 people who were contemporaries of Paul in the time where he was writing First Corinthians?
So I'll take the second one first. So the 500, I think there's just so much we don't know that it's difficult to know what to make of it. Were these 500 people who were kind of part of Jesus' ministry, like they had seen him preaching the Sermon on the Mount or something, and that's what they had known? Are these 500 people who'd never heard of him? We don't know. Was this an appearance where Jesus was like walking through the crowd and people were touching him and stuff like that, or was it something like where he was in the sky and people saw him as a light, like how Paul did? Was it before or after the ascension? We don't know any of these details, so it's really hard to put much weight on it. My guess, and this is a view that some people have had, I think this is most plausible to think that probably the appearance of the 500 might be in Matthew 28:16-20, when Jesus is giving the Great Commission, because when Jesus says, "Go tell my brothers," he uses that word aldephos in Greek. Um, when Jesus uses that elsewhere in Matthew, he's talking not just about the disciples, but about Christians as a whole. So it's plausible to think that because the appearance on the mountain in Matthew 28, when he gives a Great Commission, it's the only resurrection appearance that's predicted beforehand. Everyone else, he just appears, and people are surprised by it. It's unexpected, right? And people aren't anticipating it. This is the only one where he predicts it. So it's hard to imagine Jesus predicting a resurrection appearance and having no one like, oh, like you think this would be like, oh, guys, it's going to happen. Like, who wouldn't, you would tell everyone if that's how you thought it was going to go. So I think that when it says that, people bow down and worship him, but some doubted. I think that's talking about other people besides the 12 who were there. So I think it's plausible to think that that's where it was. And that's also why this was on a mountainside, right? Why do this so far out and not do it there? Well, it makes it to accommodate a large number of people is why it was on a mountain. So that's a speculation that some people have had. I think that's plausible. Other people have said maybe it's Pentecost when they're all speaking in tongues to large crowds, and there's a group, and then maybe that's the 500 because the Penta especially sounds like Pentecost. But that's not really a resurrection appearance. It's more of a Holy Spirit appearance. It's never really conflated as an appearance of Jesus in the story. So I think that's probably less likely. But it would be really interesting to know how that works. I'm inclined to think that it was something sort of like I don't know if you've heard the miracle of Fatima in Portugal in 1917, where three young school children were claiming to have said the Virgin Mary appeared to them. And so they predicted that there was going to be a big miracle in the sky on a date in October of 1917. And so there were a crowd of thousands of people, I think tens of thousands at least, who gathered there, and they looked up the sky and they saw the sun getting closer, changing colors. Different accounts say different things, but it was doing a lot of weird stuff. And so some people say this was like a mass hysteria, all that. But whatever the cause was, I think the point is like you can have large groups of people who are given a cue, anticipation, and that's what they see. And I even know of accounts from missionaries who've mentioned that there are some accounts in places like India. I know of one in Nepal where missionaries were preaching the gospel, and then people like looked at the sky, and Hindus and Taoists and stuff like that in China would see Jesus like on a cross in the sky, or would see some kind of vision of Jesus in the sky that dozens, if not 100 people saw. So it may have been something like that. I don't know. But I imagine it was probably something along those lines, to draw a parallel. In terms of Saul's conversion, the best source we have for that is his own epistles, where he talks about it. But he's unfortunately not very detailed. He says that Christ revealed himself to him through revelation. What he means by that, we're not sure. He says Christ appeared to him, and that's what makes him an apostle. But Acts gives us a more elaboration on what that might have looked like in terms of Paul seeing a light and falling on the road and going blind for a little bit, and then Ananias, healing him after that. That's what converted him. So it is pretty interesting. And you also have modern parallels to that as well, right? I keep bringing these up because I think looking at modern examples that we have more information on can help us be informed on perhaps older cases that we just don't have as much good information on. So you have accounts of people who were former terrorists, former persecutors of Christianity, who suddenly convert after having a dream or a vision of Jesus, and it changes their life forever, and they go on to be persecuted themselves by people within their community. So I think the story of Saul is really inspiring, and it's one that we sort of see repeated in different avenues even today.
Yeah, and one of the last things I would like to say when it comes to this subsection of the episode is that when it comes to mass hysteria, which you just mentioned, we know that that can happen. But when it comes to mass hallucinations, medically they say this doesn't happen. If someone has a hallucination, it's usually a person that is an individual. So I may have hallucination, and even though you're in my company, you may be perfectly well unless we consume something, but that's not the point. Now we're just saying that if we are hanging out as a band of brothers or friends doing something, if I have some mental issues or I think I'm seeing something, that's me. It's not, that's not being spread like a flu or some type of a disease. So I don't think when skeptics want to say, well, the 500 had a mass hallucination, I don't think that that's a very solid attempt to refute that they actually 500 actually saw something.
Yeah, well, I think they definitely saw something. You're right that mass hallucination is not really a term used in the medical literature because it's not really accurate. You can't literally hallucinate the same thing someone else does because the hallucination is a private experience. It's like dreaming the same thing. But what typically people mean by that is that people in sort of a state of ecstasy or excitement will point to something and other people think they can see it. There's a good article by Jake O'Connell about this in the Tyndale Bulletin from 2009 about collective hallucinations. And he says that there are cases you can find. Now, he doesn't think that Jesus' resurrection was one, but he does talk about cases where a lot of people at the same time think they see a ghost. There are sometimes where multiple people think they see the Virgin Mary in front of them. Other cases like that. So you can have, or like when people see Bigfoot and you have, oh, I saw him too, those kinds of things. So you do have a social contagion and you do have people who have mass hysteria. So it's not directly the same thing as everyone like hallucinating the exact same thing. It's not like everyone's hallucinating Jesus eating fish or something. But when people point and think they see something and people look and squint and they think they can see it too, that's more what that gets at. So that's probably a more fair way of representing that view.
Thank you for that. When it comes to the apostles potentially lying that Jesus resurrected, so that maybe their desire, maybe their motive was to start new religion, what is there to say about them? What was at stake? What the disciples could gain or lose by inventing a new religion?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a view that's held very widely, and a lot of people think the disciples probably were sincere. They were religiously devout, and they either went to their death or more likely were just being willing to be persecuted and treated badly, thrown in jail, perhaps by people. We know that happened at least with James and Paul. So I think that they were probably sincere in what they believed, but it's really hard to assess people's motivations from so long ago with so little records, right? To know why people do things, because you can imagine people being willing to die, to be martyred, right? You have people today who will go and shoot up a school and kill themselves and just be famous for 5 minutes, unfortunately. So there are people who are willing to do some crazy things for attention, to be remembered as a legacy. But I don't see the apostles really being in that camp. They don't seem as fanatic. They don't seem as destructive in that way. They seem generally good intention from the little that we know about them. And I don't think that really accounts for Paul, because you could say Paul may have wanted money or fame, but he was already pretty high status as a Sanhedrin member, as a Pharisee. So I don't see what Paul really gained by converting that he didn't already have prior to his life as a rich Pharisee with lots of money and social status. So I think that at least in those cases, most of them probably were genuinely sincere and really believed what they were saying.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, especially if we see again that there were many of them acted as cowards. Some even abandoned Jesus during his ministry. As suddenly something happens. I won't see resurrection. I mean, it is resurrection, but let's say I'm a skeptic. So something happens,
Right.
And now these cowards are, witnessing on the street, ready to lay their lives not just for the gospel, but also they're now willing to forgive their enemies, to love them, to be persecuted, to be abandoned by their families, to lose any possession, even though they didn't have much. We see a sudden transformation, and you have to ask yourself and be intellectually honest with yourself if you're a skeptic. Well, what happened for all of them to change so much? What could have happened that they will go from point A to point B so radically and so fast? Like, there had to be something that they saw, and they cannot go against what they know is true. And for me, that's also a very solid evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah, I think they lost the fear of death because they believed that they saw their master, their best friend, risen again in a new body, and was telling them, hey, this is what's going to happen to you and to all Christians. We're going to be raised from the dead again. So at that point, being fearful of death doesn't do much to you. So they were like, yeah, you can do whatever you want to us. We know where we're going, and we know what's going to happen to us. So I think it's almost what you see with the Maccabean martyrs in the book of Maccabees, where they're literally dismembered limb from limb in a really graphic way. And they talk about how, oh, I'm going to get this hand back in the afterlife. I'm going to do all that stuff when I'm raised again from the dead. Because a lot of Jews, at least Pharisaic Jews, believed in the eschatological resurrection. So I think that's the mindset that the apostles were in. It's like, you know what? You can crucify me. You can do whatever you want, because I'm going to be with Jesus, and I'm going to get this body back at someday.
Yeah, I can only try to put myself in their shoes. How scared they were, and once when they saw Jesus, how much they brought confidence to the new faith, how much it brought courage, how much it brought like. And imagine, this is almost like an eschatological picture, as we know that Jesus promised He will come back for us, He won't leave us as orphans, and in the eschaton we'll have this wedding feast where we'll eat together with Jesus. And before that even happens, Jesus comes back, He resurrects, and now He's cooking fish for His disciples. It's almost like this pre-eschatological picture of what will happen, but on a massive scale, when all the Christians that whoever lived, prophets, disciples, regular people like myself, spending time with Jesus, eating in the eschaton. But now Jesus is spending time again with His disciples. Just before His crucifixion, He did when He took them and He broke the bread and poured out the wine, and He said, take this, this is my body and my blood, take it. And I'm just thinking how much that closeness inspired them, not just to be courageous, but also to like, oh, I have this love for my Lord, I have this peace that whatever happens to me, I'll be fine. It just that's how I'm perceiving.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said, and I think that kind of hits on other things I'm looking at in our outline about like willingness to die, point to their sincerity, and even the radical transformation. People like Paul and James, Jesus' brother, who some people say may have been skeptical of his brother's ministry prior to that, and to Peter as well, who had, as we know, betrayed Christ. So I think you do see radical transformations in all their life, and it's a perfect analogy to the average Christian life as well, that while there is a literal death and resurrection of all of us as well, there's also a spiritual one, in the sense that we die to ourselves and we become radically transformed in Christ and become passionate to share the gospel, just as the apostles did. Now, we don't always have the same miraculous power that Paul did. People aren't coming to touch our clothes so that they're healed. But nonetheless, it's still invigorating to see people passionate about sharing the gospel to bring spiritual life and resurrection to people in both a more of a metaphorical and also a literal way when it comes to the eschaton.
Yeah, you mentioned James, and I was just about to mention his story. I found his conversion story so compelling for the resurrection of Christ, because based on the translation for the word of was James Jesus's half brother or a cousin, that's irrelevant. But the thing is that during his ministry, except Mary, Jesus's siblings or cousins, again depending on the translation, they're doubting.
You're doing the Catholics and Orthodox who want to say,
yeah. So based on the scripture, we know that Jesus' family consider him almost, and it's not blasphemous to say almost nuts and crazy. They thought that he was not okay. So that means they didn't believe when he was trying to say that he's the coming prophesied Messiah. So we see all of this almost stigma following Jesus from his family until he dies. Then something quote unquote happens, and we see James, his half brother, becoming now one of the most important Christians of the early church. And I think that's mentioned in Acts 15, right? When Paul goes to meet with Peter and the others who are like the foundation of the
Yes,
early church. And
Acts
now
15 and Galatians 1 and 2 as well.
yeah, so now you see James is like he switched from someone who was a skeptic, doubting his own brother or half brother, now to be as one of the foundational stones to the first church. I mean, how amazing that is, Caleb. Would you agree that this is such a solid argument when it comes to the resurrection of Christ?
Yeah, I think it's solid to see the transformation of someone. And we know that James was head of the church, or was one of the main apostles, from how Paul talks about them as being one of the pillars in Galatians, I think 2. So to have the brother of Christ, and you can only imagine how cynical it would be to be him, right? If your brother was perfect human being, God incarnate, you can only imagine how much your parents would want to compare you to, and how much, why can't it be more like Jesus? So I can imagine them having a lot of, and I'm just speculating here, but being consistent with Christian theology, like James probably would have been very bitter towards Jesus and would have been very much jealous of him, and probably not the most empathetic towards him. But to see him not only coming around, and whether that was because he felt guilty after Jesus died, or whether because he saw the resurrection, or both. The fact that James is willing to lay down his life, Josephus mentions that James was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin, granted probably for political reasons and not purely out of martyrdom, but nonetheless that James was willing to be in the Jerusalem church for 30 some odd years, dedicated to that, for his brother, who he can only have had rough relationships with before that, is amazing. It's quite profound, as you said.
Yeah. When it comes to the women being the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, why is that important when it comes to the cultural context, when it comes to the Judaism and the whole Jewish religion and culture?
So I have an article on this, the blog article, and also Than Christophilus recently did a video, and I helped him with the script on that, about that argument. So short version is that in Jewish culture, there were certain people who generally weren't really supposed to be giving testimony in a court of law because they were considered either dishonest or duplicative, very easily deceived. So that would include people with dishonest occupations, slaves, children, and women, because a lot of Jewish thought at the time, and you see this from like Philo and other authors, was that women were sort of just inferior spiritually, intellectually to men. They were very easily tricked. Paul even talks about old wives' tales, and I think it's in 2 Timothy about that. So the sentiment that women were sort of very, very easily misaligned was a nice way of putting it. Was the sentiment, and that's why Josephus says, "Let not the testimony of woman be accepted." And I know there's a couple places in, I think it's in, I want to say it's in the Talmud or one of the Mishnahs, where there's like prayers that are given, like, "Lord, thank you that I'm not a Gentile, and thank you that I'm not a woman," in that way. And you even have the critic Celsus, pagan critic in the 2nd century, is quoted by Origen, who's critiquing the resurrection, and he says, and who did he show himself to? A hysteric woman, Mary Magdalene, and all this stuff. And then when other people point out, well, she wasn't the only one, other people saw it, he's like, well, other people were deceived by her delusion. And elsewhere, Celsus talks about how the Christian message is only believed by the stupid, the meek, the silly, the women, and the children. So it was very much a sentiment that women were just frankly stupid, or at least not educated enough to be trusted in those kind of decisions. So the fact that they had such a prominent role in the early Christian ministry was pretty remarkable and quite risky, and if anything may have turned some people away from the faith, like how Celsus says. And it's also funny because this wasn't this is an argument that apologists use for like the empty tomb where women are witnesses, but this is a fairly recent argument when you look at the history of Christian discourse, because up from the early Enlightenment period, like the 1700s to the mid 19th century, skeptics were the ones using this argument. They were saying, well, the fact that women were the first ones to see this is a red flag, because women have all these bestial passions and are incompetent and all this stuff. And it wasn't until like the rise of early feminism that you sort of see this be turned around and used by the apologists, where it flips sides with like, oh, well, the fact that they used embarrassing women was a good thing, and because it shows that they were sincere and they wouldn't make it up. So it's just kind of funny that this started off as an argument that skeptics used against the resurrection that apologists were playing defense on, and the apologists never responded with, women are equal to men, and so it's just you're being bigoted by saying that. It was usually, well, but other men saw it too. And I think even John Calvin has a quote where he talks about how Jesus tells us to humble ourselves and to make ourselves like children. And so he's like, so Jesus was humbling the apostles by showing himself to women so that they would be humbled, because, we have to make ourselves full. We've become like fools. We have to become foolish and childlike, like the women were. So John, it was sort of just embraced by them, but they were clearly embarrassed by it for a while. So I think it says a lot about the equality of women and the Christian message and the importance that women had in the early church in that way. So yeah, the fact that women were the first ones to proclaim the resurrection of Christ and the gospel message itself, I think says a lot to us and really should mean a lot today in terms of how we treat minorities within the church.
Thank you for that. I'll just read two very short verses from 1 Corinthians 15 that are kind of well known, but I would just want to read them because they're very important for this segment. Verse 14 says, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." And then verse 17, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins." So for Paul, resurrection was very well. It was crucial to our faith, and I think this should put emphasis on ourselves again, not just to have blind faith in Christ, but to know these details that apologists are teaching us, that you're teaching us and helping us understand. Because I think that gathering data will help us not just to strengthen our own faith as Christians, but also to present this case with so much more data when we speak with atheists and our friends who may be from different religions. Would you agree with this and with Paul?
Yeah, I think the resurrection is, as I think N.T. Wright would say, it's the future Christian hope. It's the hope that we have to be alive again in Christ. When we die, we're not just discarded and rot away. We come back in a glorified body like Christ did. And so that's always been the Christian message of salvation and future life. So I think that that's a really remarkable thing, and it's the center point of the Christian faith, along with the atonement of Christ.
Thank you for that. Caleb, I have one more thing, and we're pretty much done for today. Let me read a quote. It's a paragraph from a very famous New Testament scholar, Ronald Nash. So supposedly New Testament material has some parallels with the cults of Athis, Isis, Osiris, Adonis, or Mithra. And we know that skeptics have been saying this for decades, right? We know the documentary Zeitgeist and all these, ridiculous claims that people have been, trying to make. So skeptics claim that these gods all died and rose again. But Ronald Nash, who was a theologian and apologist and a professor of philosophy at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida, and at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, he researched the religious documents of the different pagan deities, and he concluded that the tide of scholarly opinion has turned dramatically against attempts to make early Christianity dependent on the so-called dying and rising gods of Hellenistic paganism. Nash has compared the Gospels with those mythological documents and did not find many similarities. Additionally, many of these ancient pagan myths came after Jesus' era, so it could be concluded that their cults have been actually influenced by Christianity, not the opposite. In his conclusion, Nash argues that there are actually very few references to the notion of rebirth in the evidence that has survived, and even these are either very late or very ambiguous. Hugo Ranner, who was a noted theologian and church historian, said that Christianity, as revealed by God in Christ, has in neither its genesis nor its growth anything fundamental in common with the ancient mysteries. You can take as much time as you would like to comment on this, because I think it's very important when people come and accuse us that Christianity just borrowed from the pagan myths.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I would just say that there's the main book on the dying and rising gods aspect. I would point to Mettinger's book. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but from 2001, when he goes over this and discusses it, and he says that there are some examples you can find of dying and rising gods as a trope before the time of Christianity, but he doesn't find the parallels to be overly analogous, and Christ does stand out in many ways. I know N.T. Wright has a very large book on this where he talks about how the notion of resurrection in the context of Christianity was pretty unique and counter to how Jews typically understood at the time resurrection, because there was always an eschatological event. And I know that there was a book, I think, Respond to Love Writes material by, I want to say it was John Granger Cook, maybe, called Resurrection Apotheosis or something like that. And he has his own views on that. I actually have a friend who happens to be atheist and skeptic named Derek Bennett, who has written quite a lot on this topic, and he does take the view that there are some parallels prior to the time of Christ. But you are right when it comes to zeitgeist. That's not really taken seriously by anyone. It's crank scholarship that's coming from, I think, a guy named Gerald Massey from like the 19th century. That doesn't cite any of the original source material. So like the Horus and some of those analogies are not accurate at all. But now you can find some people like maybe Osiris and perhaps Zalmoxis, and some people would say Romulus, who do predate Christianity, that have resurrection elements. But again, it really depends how you're defining it, because in the broad sense, they are resurrected. But if you want to get specific, Romulus doesn't really die. He's more of assumed into heaven, and it's not clear if he's dead or not. And Osiris is given life again, but he's in a mummified body and he's taken to the underworld. So whether that's a resurrection on earth is a little bit debated. So it really depends on how you're defining resurrection, how you're defining death to life, and in that sense. But I think the Christian sense of resurrection is unique primarily because, one, Jews viewed resurrection in the eschatological sense. It was a it was something that happened at the end of time, typically. It was a collective event, so it was supposed to happen to everyone at once during the eschaton, or at least it was a sequence. It was an era in which it happened. And I think they may have got, when they were in the exile from the Persians and Zoroastrianism, that belief might come from there. But it was a collective event. It was an eschatological event in that way. So, and there was debate whether the people who were resurrected, like the wicked, are they annihilated, or are they resurrected at all as well? But those are like the key differences. So what Christians were supposing is that Christ was resurrected as part of this eschatological group, but nevertheless is sort of the precursor. Paul calls him the first fruits of the resurrection, the sign that the end times are near, that the general resurrection has begun, so to say. And that might be why you have in Matthew 27:51-53, where when Jesus crucified, the other dead raised as well, right? Whether that's sort of apocalyptic literature or apocalyptic symbolism that you see in some of the other Greek poets. So yeah, one can find some parallels to the general notion of dying and rising gods to some extent. Some of it does postdate Christianity, some of it does predate it, depending on how you're defining resurrection. But I think the Christian concept, the Christian adaptation of that belief, let's say, did have unique elements that you don't really see shared in some of these other earlier ones, like the eschatological aspect, like the collective aspect and the salvific aspect and so forth. So that's what I would say to that.
Caleb, thank you so much. Just for the very ending, two short things. Where can the audience find you? And do you have any final message both to the Christians and non-Christians when it comes to this topic? Why is it so important? Is there anything that Christians can be learning from this topic that could or should encourage their faith? And what about our skeptic friends when it comes to approaching this topic?
So in terms of where to find my stuff, yeah, I do have a book called Undead I mentioned at the beginning. That's on Amazon if anyone wants to check that out. And I'm currently working on a much bigger book on miracles, but that's not strictly tied to resurrection. But thematically, there are similarities. And I also have plenty of blog posts on it on thinkchristiantheism.com, as well as some debates. If you just type in Caleb Jackson resurrection debate or empty tomb debate, you'll see several of them come up. So just check out any of those. If you're curious into further arguments and engaging with people on those discussions respectfully. In terms of what I would say to Christians, I would say that the resurrection, as I had mentioned earlier, is the pinnacle of the Christian faith. It's meant to ensure our salvation, and that we live in a world that has many great things, many beautiful things, but also many terrible things. And so for people to have millions of people a year who die, who starve to death, who die of diseases, who die of wars unjustly, who have dreams that never come true, who waste their lives on substances and all of these tragic things and go through unimaginable pain. If this is the only life we have, then it is an embarrassment of tragedy that there's so many human lives that have just been wasted, so many potentials, and some people who had their one shot in the sun, their one brief moment, extinguished like that, without any kind of hope, without any kind of redemption, without any kind of forgiveness for their wrongdoings. But if this isn't the only life we have, and there is something after this, and there is a resurrection, there is an afterlife, there is a judgment, there is salvation, then I think we do have hope, that we do have redemption, we do have a happy ending to this in that way. And so that's not to say that that alone makes it true, but it should be the view that we should hope is true. It should be the view that should be more meaningful. The fact that one cannot say that life has meaning and also say that the suffering doesn't have meaning. And if the suffering has meaning, then for it to be redeemed, to be extinguished in the finality of our existence, I think is the most poetic ending one can have, rather than this very tragic notion that so many people, just by victims of circumstance, can go through unfair and truly horrific circumstances that are often out of their control. And if there isn't a God to mitigate that, if there isn't an afterlife, well, then God help us all. So that's, hate to end it on a sad note, but I think that's the importance of why the resurrection and why belief in salvation is so important to me and to hopefully every other Christian on earth.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really beautifully said at the end. I hope people will listen to this, both Christians and non-Christians. Just meditate and dwell on the whole episode and this season of resurrection, even though most of us celebrated a month ago, but because again, our Eastern Orthodox friends are celebrating today. May you find hope. May you find may you be encouraged to research when it comes to the life, uh, ministry and resurrection of Jesus, and may he be resurrected in your Christ. And I will just quote our Eastern Orthodox friends who said, Christ is risen. May he be risen also in your heart. Caleb, thank you so much for finding time for us tonight. I will include the link for your blog. I have already included the link for your book. Again, guys, please support Caleb's work. Buy the book on Amazon, and please continue subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing videos when it comes to our ministry podcast. That being said, thank you once again, Caleb, and God bless everyone. Go serve your King, and I'll see you next Sunday. God bless.